Here we go. All right, so standard disclaimer, the opinions expressed here are those of mine and do not necessarily reflect the policy of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. If I mention, cite any of the regulations, I try to cite it. I don't cite it. I basically rewrite it in a simplified version. So you should, for complete and accurate description of the regulatory requirements, we ask you to go to the OHRP website where you'll find them as they are written out. So here are the learning objectives. As I've said, there will be two parts to this presentation. For part one, I will talk about secondary research, explain what it is under the common rule, describe the options for secondary research, and also explain the ethical considerations for conducting research in general. That part will take about 20 plus minutes, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues to do part two, at which point they will repeat, they will tell you about the learning objectives. So here we go. So what is secondary research, right? This is the research use of information, individuals' information or biospecimens that were originally collected, acquired for either non-research purposes, and examples of this would be information collected for, say, routine clinical care. People go to the doctor to have a diagnosis made, and they might have blood tests being taken. The doctor will ask them about their history and conduct physical examination. All that kind of information may be entered into an electronic format, but that's all done for the purpose of clinical care. Right? So that's not done for the information, or the biospecimens were not collected for research purposes. Now, information, it's been collected all over the place today, right? So we could be registering to attend a course, or, completing census data, all sorts of, different reasons for submitting information. So those will be information that is collected, originally collected not for research purpose, right? So all that type of information can be used by researchers to conduct secondary research. Or, right, the information or biospecimens were actually collected under a research setting. So researchers could be doing a clinical trial. They may be interacting and intervening. So they may be interacting with participants, recruiting them, asking them for specific information for the purpose of the research, and then collecting blood, doing MRI, CT scans specifically for the purpose of the research. Now, that would be primary research. However, all that data and specimens or results that were collected for that particular research can subsequently be used in other research, right? And so when research studies other than the proposed one, so when we're using data that came from other research, we're not collecting them with individuals for this currently proposed research, that will also be considered as secondary research. And I'm telling you that the research use of HeLa cells is secondary research. And, Danielle and Cheryl will explain a little bit more about HeLa cells later on. So the concept of secondary research actually comes from the definition of human subjects at 46.102E in the Common Rule. The term secondary research is not defined, but the term human subject is. So the regulatory definition for human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research. There are two parts to this definition. So either investigator conducting research obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, and then use that information for the research study, use it, analyze it, etc. Right. So that's the first part of the human subject definition. Again, when investigators, intervene, so do something with people for the purpose of the research, or interact with them. So interacting through, conversations, getting information for them, doing surveys, etc. Specifically for that particular research, that's human subject, and that's what we call primary human subjects research. So if the investigators, for the purpose of the research, are not interacting or intervening with living individuals to collect their information or biospecimens for that research, there is another way that we can satisfy the definition of human subject, and that is when investigator obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. And this is the part where we would refer to as secondary human subjects research. So in other words, for this part, investigators are not doing anything with living individuals specifically to collect their information or biospecimens for the research. What they are doing is that they're just having access, right, to people's identifiable information or biospecimens that have been collected previously for some other reasons, right? So investigators are coming in and they're asking to use this information, this private information or biospecimens. And when they use this private information or biospecimens, use it in an identifiable manner, that is when we refer to that type of research as secondary research and secondary human subjects research. So in secondary research, there is no intervention or interaction done with individuals specifically for the purpose of this currently proposed research. So hopefully that's clear. So when is secondary research not human subjects research? So I thought that, it's good to just give you a brief refresher of the secondary research, because a lot of research today, big data research, a lot of that kind of research is actually secondary research, right? Researchers are not going out, they're proposing a research, but they're not going out to, interact or intervene like in a clinical trial situation. That would be typical, right? They're not doing that, but they're actually making use of information or biospecimens that have been collected otherwise, right? So, so first of all, when is secondary research not human subjects? So first of all, you need to ascertain that this is secondary research. It meets the research that the researcher is proposing, meets the criteria we just talked about. There's no interacting or intervening with people specifically to collect their information for the current research, right? Plus, when the researchers are only using non-identifiable private information or non-identifiable biospecimens, when both these conditions are met, then this is not human subjects research, right? If you remember our definition just now, right, it is specifically referring to identifiable information. When there's no identifiable information and the information was collected already, for other reasons in the past, when both these two conditions are met, then the researcher is not considered as doing human subjects research under the common rule. Here's a reminder here for you. Consider the research project. So when you're thinking about when somebody is trying to make a determination as to whether a research project that is submitted by a researcher is actually, not human subjects research, think of the secondary research and not human subjects research. Think of the research project as a whole, right? Think of the purpose, consider the purpose, why the researcher is doing this, what they are doing, the whole thing. Do not just look at one activity and then make a determination. And the reason why I say that is that in the past, we have had situations where people thought that a particular research project that is a primary research project that involves an intervention and researchers looking at what happens after the intervention. But because researchers are saying, oh, we are just going to be looking at routine data that will be collected in any case, right? Anyway, so the routine data that is being collected clinically anyway. And since we're just looking at that data, this is actually, data not collected specifically for this project. So this is secondary research and so on. Well, that particular project may not be secondary research because if you think about it, some researchers actually introduce an intervention upstream. They might have introduced a new sort of type of care. They've incorporated into the clinical care, and then downstream they're looking at whether, looking at results, whether the intervention they've introduced actually changed anything. But then the data they're collecting are actually, similar to what, in clinical care that, clinicians would normally collect. So there's nothing new to the data they're collecting. And sometimes, just referring to that kind of data as just clinical data, we're not doing anything we're not collecting anything different, does not actually reflect the entire picture. Because an intervention has been introduced, because the purpose was to look at whether the intervention actually changed anything downstream. So that is actually a primary research project, and it would not be secondary research and so on. So just be careful with that when you're thinking about secondary research and making determination as to whether something is human subjects research or not downstream. So what are the options for conducting secondary research, right? So an entire research involves, if the entire research, and by the way, when we think about secondary, we're thinking about it from the perspective of the investigators that are proposing this project, right? They come along, they're telling you that, oh, we're interested in using data or biospecimens that have been collected through for other reasons, for other purposes, from other reasons, and we're using that to do this research that we're proposing. All right, so that's the situation that we're talking about. So then you look at the entire research, and that entire research involves the use of identifiable data or biospecimens at some point. Then this would be human subjects research because of the fact that they are using identifiable individual information or biospecimens. Now, if that's the case, then you ask, that is still secondary research, but that is human subjects research. Then you can ask the question, the next question, does the whole research meet the conditions for one or more exempt categories? So it can be human subjects research, but then it may also meet one of the 8 exempt categories. Now, for secondary research in the common rule, secondary human subjects research, there are the typical exempt categories that may be applicable would be the exempt category 4. That is the most typical one. Exempt category 7 and 8 are also catered specifically for secondary research, but then there may be other exempt categories that might work, right? So you want to take a look. If once you've determined that this is secondary research, this is human subjects research, then you can ask the question, where does it fit into, does the entire research fit into one or more exempt categories? If it does, then maybe it can be exempt from the common rule as well, from the common rule, typical common regulatory requirements. Now, so that's what I just said. But if it doesn't, then we will consider that as non-exempt human subjects research. And this is the type of research that needs to go through what we all know about IRB review, the informed consent requirements as stipulated in 116. And then, institutions that are doing that will need to file a federal-wide assurance with OHRP. So these are some of the typical requirements when it's a non-exempt human subjects research, right? So again, we're talking about specifically secondary research. If the secondary research involves the use of identifiable, individual identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, then it will be human subjects research, even though it's secondary research. But this human subjects research could potentially meet the conditions of one or more exempt categories. All right. Now, so that's one option. What are the other options? So of course, the entire research could be that research as well. We don't need any of the information or being identifiable, or that we get the biospecimens, but we don't need to know where the biospecimens came from, right? So if the entire research only involves the use of non-identifiable private information or non-identifiable biospecimens, go back to the definition of human subjects, which says identifiable, right? So it's not identifiable here, so then it's not human subjects research, right? And so when it's not human subjects research, basically you stop there. You don't even have to look further and see whether the common whether there are other common rule regulatory requirements that apply. You just basically stop. The rest, we don't have to consider the rest anymore, right? And then another possibility is the entire research only involves the use of data and biospecimens from deceased individuals. The materials actually came from people who are deceased, right? It could be identifiable or not identifiable, but because it does not meet the definition of human subjects in the common rule anymore, so this will be considered as not human subjects research. And again, the common rule then stops. You don't have to think about whether there needs to be IRB review, whether, the research needs to satisfy the informed consent requirements in 116, etc. Simply stop there. The common rule regulatory requirements that we just talked about don't apply. So here I just want to make sure that you're all, paying attention. So here's a question for you. Which of the following statements best describes the use of HeLa cells in research? And I think Spencer could put up the poll. Yeah. I'll give you another few seconds. So the first response is primary human subjects research. The second one is secondary human subjects research, or not human subjects research because the cells are non-identifiable, not human subjects research because it doesn't involve living individuals, not research under the common rule. So choose the best response in your opinion. All right, I think we have enough time. Spencer, do you want to close it and see what everybody says? Whoops, do we not? Okay, great. Okay, interesting. All right, so can I show the results? If I show the result, the poll will go away, right? Okay, let's stay there. All right, it's not primary human subjects research because there's no interacting or intervening. There's, the researchers who are proposing the research now, they're not going out to interact with people, with the person to get the HeLa cells. They are not doing something to a person to get the HeLa cells, right? The HeLa cells already exist, right? And we'll talk about that. Obviously, I mean, I haven't explained what HeLa cells are, so maybe that's a problem, but you'll find out. So there's no going out to interact and intervene with people for the purpose of this currently proposed research. So it's not primary human subjects research. Now, what about not human subjects research because the cells are non-identifiable? Yes, I guess if you choose this, I would not say it's completely wrong, except that, with HeLa cells coming from Henrietta Lacks, over time, because of Rebecca Skloot's book, because of all the, some of the ethical concerns that were raised, many people actually know what HeLa cells are and who they came from originally. So in theory, they were meant to be not identifiable, but because there's been so much coverage and, people have written, Rebecca Skloot has written a book about it. Therefore, it's hard to say it's not identifiable, right? So what about secondary human subjects research? Yes. And, again, you could be saying that because to you, it is identifiable. So it is secondary research because there's no interacting and intervening on this occasion. And it is actually identifiable because there's been so much coverage. So, I wouldn't say that's wrong either. I personally chose D, not human subjects research, because it doesn't involve living individuals. I think for me, that is the most straightforward and best response for this particular question. Again, I put this question up, for fun, just to see how you guys respond. So I personally think that D is the most straightforward. But, like I said, B, C could potentially be right in one way or another, right? E, not research under the common rule. And some people might even say that, depending on whether the research is being funded by the federal government or whether the institutions has actually, an institution where the researchers work at have actually so-called checked the box to have the common rule applied to all the research, regardless of funding. So that's just there to give a bit of trick as well, a trick question. So anyway, let's move on. So here's a reminder. The Common Rule Regulatory Framework provides a baseline standard for human research protections, typically for federally funded non-exempt human subjects research. For those of you who are kind of familiar with the Common Rule, it really typically applies to non-exempt human subjects research. And we asked typical standard questions in order laid out, that we recommend to determine whether something is non-exempt human subjects research, right? Now, the regulatory framework provide a baseline standard. It doesn't mean that if the research that falls outside the common rule, that the common rule the common doesn't apply. It doesn't mean automatically that the research that one is going to propose that, common rule does not apply, that it's necessarily of little or no risks to subjects at all. There could potentially sometimes be risk to that research, right? So the fact that the common rule does not apply to the research does not mean that that research is little or have no risk to subjects. And it does not necessarily mean that it's free of ethical concerns either, right? So it just, the common rule is there to provide kind of a standard framework for, things that usually may be considered a little bit potentially more risky to human subjects or for other reasons, right? But the fact that it's outside of the common rule doesn't mean that researchers can go away saying, oh, well, this is fine, there's no risk to people, or that, that's fine, I don't have to think about any ethical concerns whatsoever. That's not the case. And similarly, for research that the common rule regulates, right? Mere compliance does not mean that the research study is necessarily protective or free from ethical concerns. Again, I mean, this is the opposite, right? So if your research, yes, it's non-exempt human subjects research, the common rule is, let's say here, you're getting federal funding and the common rule applies. Right. And then you're complying with everything the common rule says, right? You're doing all the good things, right? But the mere compliance of it does not mean that, oh, well, your research is fine. There's absolutely no ethical concerns and you don't have to think about people anymore. No, that's not the case. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is, apart from regulatory compliance, think about the ethics of your research. And this is really, really important, right? Whenever you do anything, propose anything that involve human beings, whether it's just their materials that have already been collected, think about the ethical implications, right? I put out two, examples here for you to think about. So the genetic research among the Havasupai. So a cautionary tale. So this is a story, many of you probably have heard about it. So many years ago, researchers went ahead and, talked to the Havasupai tribe and wanted to do some research with them and collected their information. So that was primary research that they did. And then so researchers collected a bunch of materials and information. And some other researchers came along, wanted to propose doing secondary research and actually wanting to use the materials without people's identifiers. The researchers who proposed the secondary research came along, okay, and they said, we don't want to have identifiable information. We just want to be able to use the materials, the information that were collected or the biospecimens to go ahead and do research on schizophrenia. Now, and then there were other research that was done to look at the origins of how people of that tribe came about to this, to this geographical area, and so on. So that eventually, the members of the Havasupai tribe found out about these research that was being done. Now, of course, the secondary research without identifies they're outside of the common rule. So institutions, received the proposal, approved it without, requiring any other sort of regulatory compliance or kind of oversight requirements. However, that caused an uproar, partly because, when the members of the Havasupai tribe found out about it, they felt, well, these are not the kind of research. I mean, they feel that, those are very sensitive subject matter, looking at schizophrenia, looking at, where tribes came from. They were very sensitive to the tribe. And at the end of the day, they never, when they first agreed to have the original research, they never actually agreed and never thought that these other research could be done using their, materials, albeit non-identifiable. So that caused a lot of discontent, if you like, and people really kind of thought, well, was it ethical to do it? So there are ethical concerns here. And another type of research that is common these days with secondary research is like some of these big data research. And a while ago, there was research that looked at people's, trying to develop recidivism scores for people who may be, because of certain factors that, indicate that that person having those factors having a higher score, may have a chance of, committing crimes again in the future, and so on. So researchers made use of large data sets and then developed these so-called recidivism scores. And lo and behold, it caused a lot of attention as well. And the controversy was, well, the score seems to particularly, there were higher scores associated with, for example, Black defendants, as opposed to their white counterparts. And then when people looked at where the data were coming from, researchers were basing the development of the scores on data that were sort of biased data that were not completely representative of all the population. They didn't take into consideration of different factors. And so ultimately, I mean, that particular research was also like research outside of the common. So I'm just wanting to use these examples to illustrate that, you know, the fact that something is outside the common rule or that they don't need to comply with the common rule does not mean that the research will have no ethical concerns whatsoever. It's really, at the end of the day, it's important to think about research as a whole and with the ethics behind it. And for ethical considerations, the Belmont reports ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, you know, minimizing harms to individuals and maximizing the benefits to the individuals or benefits to their community as a whole, and the principle of justice, right? Equitable distribution of burden and benefits. These are the three fundamental ethical principles that commonly relied upon when we do human subjects research. There are other important principles that researchers ought to think about that concerns sort of scientific validity, right? Things like that. So there are other ethical principles at work as well that I just want to lay it out there for you. So does the Belmont Principles provide an adequate ethical framework for research to implicate third parties in a significant manner? So I'm putting it out there because as we move on to Cheryl's and Danielle's presentation, and they explain the origins of the HeLa cells, and the reason why they are so concerned with HeLa cells being used in whole genome sequencing, because partly that concerns third parties down the line as well. So there are that particular consideration that, you know, they'll talk about in a bit. With that, my part of the presentation is finished. Before I leave, I just want to put it out there that there are two upcoming events, virtual events, or rather events that you can watch online. So the first one is the 50th anniversary commemoration of the National Research Act, from which came about the Belmont Report and subsequent regulations, right? So this is going to happen on July the 12th in the afternoon, 12 o'clock Eastern time. So that's the website. You can find the information on our website. If you're on our homepage, you can just click on the banner on our homepage and it will take you to the details for that particular event. So it is going to be a 2.5 hours event, and we're going to look at the past, look at the present, and then look into the future. The other event is the OHRP Annual Exploratory Workshop. We're going to be talking about AI research, and this will be on a Thursday in September, on September the 19th, and you can watch it as a live stream online. So here are our standard contacts, OHRP at HHS.gov. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Cheryl and Danielle. And let me just stop sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Yvonne. I'll share my screen. Great. We're so glad to be here. My name is Dr. Cheryl Jacobs, and I'll be presenting along with Dr. Danielle Winchester. As Yvonne said, we're from the National Institutes of Health, and we're in the Office of Science Policy, and we're really excited today to discuss the agreement the NIH has with the LAX family concerning HeLa cell whole genome sequence data. And just before we begin, we want to disclose that we don't have any relevant personal, professional, or financial relationships to disclose. So our goals for the discussion is to give background about HeLa cells and the LAX family, to give an overview of the agreement the NIH has with the Lax family, and a touch on continuing efforts NIH is conducting to promote the agreement. So background on HeLa cells in the Lax family. Yvonne kind of touched on it in the previous segment about Henrietta Lacks being the originator of HeLa cells. Mrs. Henrietta Lacks, at the time she was 31 years old. She was diagnosed with aggressive cervical cancer and went to Johns Hopkins for treatment in 1951. Unfortunately, 8 months later, she succumbed to the disease and she died. But before her death, doctors at Johns Hopkins biopsied her cervical cancer and attempted to grow the cells in culture. The cells were soon, from the biopsy tumor, were soon found to be immortal, meaning that they grew continuously outside of the body in cell culture. This was invaluable to research, and these became the first human cell lines to be able to grow continuously in culture, and were then named HeLa cells, HE from Henrietta and LA for Lax. But one thing to point out that these cells were established and used without Henrietta Lacks' knowledge or her consent. 20 years later, the identity behind HeLa cells were made public, and it was known that Henrietta was the originator of the cells. And this started challenges for the Lacks family. And as Yvonne said, there was a popular book written in 2010 by Rebecca Skloot called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And again, that brought wide attention to Henrietta Lacks, the descendants of Henrietta Lacks, as well as HeLa cells. In 2013, researchers in Germany sequenced HeLa cells to create the first HeLa cell whole genome sequence. And this data was shared through the International Nucleotide Sequence Database Consortium, which was an unrestricted access database. The Lacks family remained known about this. And at the time, Jerry Lacks Y, granddaughter of Henrietta Lacks, said that she looked at these, meaning the HeLa whole genome sequence data, that these were the medical records that were just out there for the world to see. The German researchers complied to the request of the Lacks family, and they removed the data. But at the same time, an NIH-funded publication that had also sequenced HeLa cells was pending in Nature, and per the journal requirements, they were required to share that data in some sort of repository, and they were going to share it in an unrestricted access repository. There was growing public and media attention, and NIH, realizing that the agency funded a significant amount of research with HeLa cells, stepped in and reached out to the family. And between April and July of 2013, NIH and the Lacks family looked to craft a long-term solution. But they needed a solution to match the problem. HeLa cell data is everywhere, and HeLa cells are the most widely used HeLa cells, human cells in the world. A lot of HeLa cell genomic data is available already in unrestricted access databases or public databases. And with technology, HeLa cells can be sequenced at any time. However, the family had been brought through decades of unwanted intrusions and surprises and really wanted that to stop. But the challenge was that no one had broken any laws. So whatever solution that was going to be crafted needed to advance science, respect the Lacks family, and catalyze policy advances. Well, all this came together in August of 2013, where the NIH and the Lax family reached an agreement on how to access HeLa cell genomic data and also where to store HeLa cell genomic data when it's generated. And so this got a lot of press in journals and in newspapers alike. And we see some members of those who crafted this agreement. In the portrait center left, we see former NIH Director Francis Collins with former Associate Director for Science Policy in the Office of Science Policy, Director Kathy Hudson to his left, and they're both flanked by members of the Lax family. So just a brief overview of the agreement. The agreement comes in two parts. One's for investigators requesting access to the agreement. It's through a controlled access mechanism through the NIH database of genotypes and phenotypes, or dbGaP. Requesters submit a request to NIH, and when approved, they agree to only use the data for health, medical, or biomedical research. So they will not use the data for anything that includes population origins or ancestry. They agree not to contact the Lax family. They agree to disclose any commercial plans and acknowledge Henrietta Lax and her descendants in any publications and presentation. On the other side, an NIH-funded investigator who generates HeLa cell whole genome sequence data, they're expected to submit that back to NIH to steward and for the family also to look over who would access that data in the future. And I should note that although NIH-funded investigators are expected to submit this data back to NIH, it's an encouragement from NIH and the Lax family that any non-NIH funded investigator who would generate HeLa cell whole genome sequence data, that they would also honor their agreement and submit that back to NIH. And so a central tenet of the agreement is to provide greater transparency in the use of HeLa cell data to the Lax family. So the Lax family wishes to be continually engaged how the HeLa cells are being used, as well as support biomedical research and participation in research. And the family just wants to know what's being done with HeLa cells. So to accomplish all of these goals, NIH convened a working group composed of bioethicists, geneticists, and members of the Lax family, you see here on the left in the front row, to evaluate requests for access to HeLa cell data. And so this is the current roster of the HeLa Genome Data Access Working Group. We see the working groups co-chaired by Garth Graham and Lyric Jorgensen. And Lyric Jorgensen is the director of the Office of Science Policy and the Associate Director of Science Policy at NIH. And I am the executive secretary of this group. And we're glad to have representation from the Lax family, from David Lax, Jerry Lax Y, and Veronica Robinson. So far, the working group, we'll go to the table on the right, they've evaluated 97 requests, and that's their charge. They're looking to evaluate requests for consistency to the HeLa genome data use agreement, and they are only looking for consistency to the agreement. They're not evaluating on scientific merit. They report these findings to the advisory committee to the director, or the ACD, and the ACD makes these recommendations to the NIH director, and the NIH director makes the final decisions. Going back to the table on the right, you'll see that the NIH director approved 91 requests. One was disapproved by the NIH director, and that's because the investigators were not planning on disseminating the research, and that's one of the expectations in the HeLa Genome Data Use Agreement, that knowledge is spread about the use of HeLa cell data. The other 5 were rejected due to administrative challenges, insufficient information to complete the request. And so when we look more closely into the expectations for investigators when they access HeLa cell genome data through this special process, they abide by the HeLa Genome Data Use Agreement, which I said before. A part of that is using data only for biomedical research purposes, to disclose whether it's research could result in a patent or commercial service, respect the privacy of the Lax family, and then to recognize Henrietta Lax and her descendants in all publications and presentations. Another expectation of researchers accessing HeLa cell whole genome sequence data is if they generate new HeLa cell genome sequence data, that they deposit that data back to NIH. And I should say this, in these expectations lend themselves to a researcher or an investigator, whether or not they're NIH funded. So anyone who goes through this process is expected to abide by the terms in the data use agreement. And so we see for NIH funded investigators who generate new HeLa cell data, we expect them to include this in the NIH data management and sharing plan for their funding application. So include a plan for submission of these data into dbGaP. And when it's time to submit the data to NIH, to email the HeLa Genome mailbox listed here to begin the registration and submission process. And again, although we have this for NIH-funded investigators, NIH and the Lax family are really encouraging any investigator out there to go through this process of submitting HeLa cell whole genome sequence data to NIH. And overall, whether an investigator is accessing HeLa cell data or generating new HeLa cell data to be submitted to NIH, the NIH and the Lax family expect acknowledgement of Henrietta Lax and her family in any publications, presentations, or other public reporting. And below, you can see some sample language that NIH provides as an example of use. And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Danielle Winchester, to talk about NIH continuing efforts to promote the NIH Lax Family Agreement. Danielle?
Yeah, can you hear me? Thank you, Cheryl, for passing the mic over to me. As Cheryl mentioned, my section will cover our NIH's continued efforts of promoting the NIH Lax Family Agreement. Last year marked the 10-year anniversary since the establishment of the Henrietta Lax Agreement. And given this milestone, we wanted to look at the outcomes from the agreement and also just continue to promote the effort, continue to promote acknowledgement of the agreement and within the biomedical research community. Next slide. So one of the first things that we did was, like I was mentioning just a few minutes ago, is that we wanted to look at the outcomes, and we looked at how many data sets were submitted to NIH since 2023 under the agreement, which was 16. And approximately 1/3 of these data sets represents voluntary submission. As Cheryl had walked us through, the submission and access process and the expectations under the agreement, we want to highlight these were voluntary because these were not NIH supported investigators, and they just decided to share their data back to NIH. And from this data set, we also noticed that the data is coming from 6 countries. Next slide. Next, we wanted to look at the publications, the influence of these publications that were coming from the data sets. From the 16 data sets, since 2013, 13 papers have been published. 10 were published by approved users. Those are the ones who went through the process of putting in a data access request and was approved by the director of NIH. 3 of these publications were from data submitters, those who have also submitted data. And then and from those data sets, 3 were published from the data submitters. Sorry. We used relative citation ratio. This is an NIH matrix that was developed in the Office of Portfolio Analysis here at NIH. This is a tool or method that used to measure the scientific influence of papers. So our RCR, which is short for relative citation ratio, represents a citation-based measure of scientific influence calculated as citations per year. It is normalized to the citation per year received by an NIH-funded paper in that same field. So the baseline for RCR is 1, which is denoted here in this red line. And based on the calculations of RCR, we learned that the papers from the data sets are highly influential. Publications are being cited, are highly cited from these data sets. Next slide. We also wanted to point out one of the publications that were highly cited or that we found from conducting this RCR measurement was from Jason Jury's lab. And their RCR was 25, which means if you're looking at 1, that means it was cited 25 times compared to the average NIH paper in that same field. Next slide. We also looked at the number of data access requests from 2013 to 2012. And what we noticed is that there have been a decline in these requests. And from there, we wanted to start to, I guess, understand, maybe do a deeper analysis of what can be causing or driving this diminishing of data access requests. And I'll move on to next slide. So one of the things that we did was we wanted to look at the publications, or we wanted to do an analysis where we want to see if the HeLa sequence data is providing any value. Are people still generating? If so, how are they using the data? We also wanted to see how they are obtaining data from HeLa cells. So from that analysis, we found that publications citing NIH funding continue to report generation and use of HeLa whole sequence data. So from that analysis and from the data which is shown in front of you, we came to understand that maybe there's a decrease in the awareness of the agreement in our NIH expectations that can explain what we're seeing on the diminishing of the data access request. This is just what we, theoretically or thinking that could be a reason. Just looking at the dates alone, this agreement was established in 2013. It has already been 10 years since the launch of the agreement. And then during that launch and then that establishment, as Cheryl pointed out, it was a lot of media publicity. Everybody was really excited about it. The community was, it was just really heightened within the community. And we're thinking that over time, just given that new scientists are coming into the field as other scientists are, maybe matriculating out, that maybe there's just a decreased awareness of the agreement. and, what can we do to bring more awareness to the agreement and to remind the community of the NIH expectations, which Cheryl explained in her previous slides. Next slide. So last year, we also wanted to put out a statement just reaffirming NIH's commitment to the agreement as well. And so here is just a screenshot of that blog where we also, this blog was written, director statement was written along with members of the LAX family. And it just says that we are committed to upholding our beloved, well, it's a quote from members of the family, that we are committed to upholding our beloved Henrietta Lacks legacy, continuing our partnership with the NIH to assist respectfully in propelling science and technology forward. So the family and NIH wanted to put out a joint statement, just once again, just reaffirming the commitment that we have with the Lacks family to uphold this agreement and to continue to advance science as well, responsibly. Next slide. So next, we wanted to take some action, to reinvigorate the agreement, to remind the community about the agreement as well. And so this slide just kind of outlines these steps that we are taking. One of the things that we did last year is we met with the ACD, and they agreed to move the evaluation of data access requests to an ad hoc, convening the ACD so that they can review the data access requests on an ad hoc basis. This is hoping to minimize the delays for researchers seeking access. We also published a sample data management sharing plan for applicants who are planning to generate HeLa cells whole sequence data, which is available in the NIH scientific data sharing website. And then lastly, maybe about, I want to say either beginning of this month, or in May, NIH published a guide notice that updated the expectations and that is available now to remind the community about the expectations that we kind of have explained before. And so this is also available on the Scientific Data website, and we're continuing to update other resources as needed. But one of the things that we are happy to have out now on the street is this guide notice, and I'll get into a little bit more about that in the next slide. We also want to increase our outreach efforts, kind of what we're doing today, going to scientific conferences and meetings like this or other venues just to promote the awareness of the agreement. We wanted to highlight that the co-chairs of the HeLa working group, Goff Graham and Dr. Larry Jerkison, were interviewed by the Discovery magazine recently. And so that's just another example of our efforts for outreach as we continue to promote the awareness of this agreement. And lastly, we're planning to engage major HeLa cell distributors to consider some approaches to further increase awareness of the agreement among their recipients of HeLa cells. And we're thinking with this last part of what I just was saying is that we know that people purchase HeLa cells through these commercial companies, and we're looking for opportunities that maybe we could work with them to also increase awareness through their recipients. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, NIH published a guide notice to clarify expectations for NIH-supported investigators who generate HeLa cell data or that intended to access such data in HeLa Control Access Data Repository. And so it came out May 24th, almost a month from here. And we're encouraging everyone to check out this guide notice. We also would like for folks to share the guide notice with those and with your network and your community as well. We also highlighted the agreement on the NIH scientific data sharing. So that's now available. Folks can go and visit and get additional information about the agreement on the scientific data sharing website. Next slide. And so lastly, and what I would end with, and what I mentioned previously, that the co-chairs of the HeLa working group gave an interview with the Discovery magazine. And one of the things that we felt that was that it's helpful. A key thing to point out about the agreement is that the agreement is considered a model. One in particular, or which was mentioned in the Discovery magazine, is that other scientists say that since the 2013 and the establishment of the agreement, the research community has become more aware of the importance of patient consent and privacy of their day-to-day studies. So we look at this agreement as a model of one, how to engage the community to be a part of advancing research. And I think we have one more slide left. And just to end or wrap up our presentation, how you can connect with us and engage with us, please direct all questions and comments about HeLa genome sequencing studies to the HeLa genome mailbox. You can reach me and Cheryl directly, and our emails are shown here as well. And we welcome additional opportunities to speak about the agreement. As I said, we want to continue to promote the agreement, continue to share our knowledge, and remind the community of this agreement. And from there, I think that concludes my presentation.
So thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Cheryl. I want to thank our ASL interpreter, Theo. Theo, are you the only person doing the interpretation today? Did we lose y'all? So normally we have two ASL interpreters and they rotate. I'm not sure whether we were able to find the other interpreter as well. So if not, then Theo, thank you so much. You're doing a great job. All right, so we have some questions in the chat, and I encourage anybody, we still have 15 minutes for this webinar, so I encourage anybody who has any comments and questions to continue to submit them through the chat. So since I started with part one, I think the initial questions actually are related to some of the things that I've said earlier. So let's go. So the first one is Henrietta Lacks has passed away. By my understanding, that means the use of her cells no longer qualifies as human subjects research. Is that incorrect? No, you're not incorrect. You're correct. And in fact, we had that polling question. The definition of human subjects is, living, materials obtained from living individuals. Under the common rule, these were materials that are obtained from diseased individuals. So right there, it just takes it out of the human subjects definition. However, as I have explained, the fact that it's outside of the common rule doesn't mean that there are necessarily, these kind of research would be completely free of ethical considerations and so on. So I think that what Cheryl and Danielle talked about with regards to the HeLa cells relates specifically to that. I mean, today there is maybe other sort of research that done with cell lines that came from other individuals, not identifiable, may or may not have been, the individual may or may not be deceased, and all those kind of research, it's outside the common rule, right? But again, I mean, there's no regulations to oversee it, but then sometimes there are ethical considerations that we need to think about. So for the next question, when the investigator has to access the electronic medical record and a patient's record to obtain the information they need, but are not recording the information in an identifiable manner, does this still meet non-identifiable definition? So I guess, yes, in general. First of all, when we are being presented with information like that, the first thing we want to ask is that just to make sure that the investigator has the right to access the EMR for that type of information, because you could have, investigators are not related to the clinical care or do not normally have access to a system, the electronic medical record systems. They're from outside of the institution or something, and they come in. And so the first question we always ask is whether there is a, authority to access the EMR to begin with. And then when you say downloading information without people's identifiable data, would that be considered non-identifiable? I guess that also depends, right? So First of all, as you know, how we define the word identifiable in the common rule, it's a subjective thing. It's not like, okay, it depends on the data that you're downloading. It's not like in HIPAA where you have specific data categories, right? In the common rule, identifiable is a subjective determination. And really, at the end of the day, looks at what kind of data you are downloading. So, in the case of something that is maybe a rare disease situation, right? So you may not be actually downloading people's typical so-called identifiers, but then because you are talking about a very rare disease and only so many people have it, and investigators who work in that environment probably know of everybody. And, this is an investigator who's been working in that environment. So in those situations, unusual, unique situations, then it's very unlikely that, whatever data you download probably will still say that it's, kind of identifiable in that sense, right? The other thing I want to also caution is that, okay, you've downloaded information without identifiers. The next thing we want to look at is, okay, if you're the investigators, we want to make sure that you'll not be able to go back and re-identify, right? If there are ways that you can go back and easily re-identify because of maybe codes that you've, included, or some sort of tags you've included, that you can easily go back and link the information back to the individuals from whom you obtain the information, then that to us would not count as non-identifiable. So if you're not familiar with these concepts, it'd be good to talk to your IRB office administrators who may be more familiar with how we think about what constitutes non-identifiable in the common rule. So doesn't living in the humans include the relatives of Henrietta Lacks, since genomic work has been done on her cells? So precisely because of whole genome sequencing, right, of HeLa cells, and we know who the person was who supplied the HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks. And so whole genome sequencing, obviously, her relatives, her family members, they would have concerns that it would implicate their privacy, right? So in terms of the common rule, right, I guess strictly speaking, you could say, if I'm coming to propose research and I'm using HeLa cells, I'm not using, strictly speaking, the cells from the descendants of Henrietta Lacks. Would that count as, using identifiable information from those descendants to do research? I think you need to look into the details to make some determination of, what exactly you're doing and, what may be or may not be identifiable. But I think in the case of the Henrietta Lacks situation, it is unusual because for all the various reasons, right? It was immortal cell lines. Researchers decided to not name the cell line with things like what we do today, which is maybe with a letter and a number, right? And so that, when you look at it, not everybody can tell. In the case back in those days when they decided to name it, as HeLa, which makes it kind of easier for people to re-identify and know who we're talking about. So that, we're talking about a very unusual situation here. There are some government agencies, IRBs, that still require IRB review of protocols with de-identified information or biospecimens. I think that if you're talking about common rule agencies and departments, and researchers are getting funding from those specific common rule departments and agencies, then yes, they may have specific requirements that you need to. So if you're getting funding from them, you just have to follow what they say. What I have explained to you, it's what in HHS, how we do things. And honestly, I think even though the common rule doesn't specify who should make the determination as to whether something is falls within the common rule or outside of it, we don't specify who should make that determinations. We generally would recommend that somebody who really understands how the common rule is being applied to make that determination. And often at institutions, research institutions, that particular responsibility will not be left to investigators. Usually it'd be left to people who have experience, people in the IRB office, or people who are in the HRPP, the Human Research Protection Program office. What if the information generated from the analysis from the cells ends up being about living individuals? does that then make it HSL? I think I've alluded to the fact that the definition and how we apply the common rule, and this is strictly about applying the common rule, right? It's when the investigators make the proposal in and we look at the materials that they are asking to use to conduct their research, right? Now, whatever that comes out eventually implicates certain human living individuals and that we can identify them, that's a different consideration. And I think this, speaks exactly for the fact that, apart from the ethical compliance, apart from regulatory compliance or not, right? One really needs to think about the ethical considerations, especially in today's world, when we are living in a world where data are just everywhere, and there are many ways that, we can triangulate. Something that is not within the regulations, that, the regulations do not fall within the jurisdiction of the regulations in terms of human subjects research work, in terms of compliance, does not necessarily free you from all the considerations, the ethical considerations, and maybe even thinking downstreams. I kind of raised the question of third party implicated in the research. I think those are considerations that generally the common rule doesn't take into consideration directly, but that does not mean that, necessarily that from an ethics perspective that you would not also think about those considerations. But if HeLa cells are used for genetic studies, then I guess D is the identified, doesn't apply. Again, I think in the case of HeLa cells, if you're using that for research for the purpose of the common rule, that the human subjects, it doesn't even fit the question of human subjects research. And for us, you stop there basically, right? But again, I mean, there are other ethical considerations. And in this particular case, I mean, NIH, our colleagues have just explained that, they have developed an agreement with the Henrietta Lacks family. And that was done because of ethical considerations, and that we want to advance science in a way that it would not upset, and that would continue to respect people. Right? So I think there are those other considerations. So diseased but identify equals no common rule regulations. Example, HeLa cell research. Again, we ask the question, is it research? If it's not research, you stop. You don't even have to think about the rest. If it's research, you ask the next question. Is it human subjects? We have explained earlier what the definition of human subjects is. It directly indicates living individuals, right? So you're getting private information about specimens from living individuals for the purpose of the research. If you're getting it from deceased individuals, you stop there. The common rule does not apply to you. However, again, there may be other considerations, and there may be other laws, state laws, that may apply to using materials from deceased individuals, just not the common rule. For non-NIH funded research, our journals, APT, are journals to confirm whether the DUA expectations were followed prior to publishing in any way. Rebecca was the person who raised the question. I didn't quite understand everything. Do you want to unmute yourself? Can you unmute yourself and just explain? Danielle and Cheryl, if you understand what that means, the question, can you see it? Go ahead. I think this is a question for you guys.
Yeah, I do. I think that's stating whether or not if a researcher worked with HeLa cell data or generated HeLa cell data, meaning HeLa cell whole genome sequence, does the journal check to see if the HeLa genome data use agreement was followed, and particularly when they access the data. So no, the journal does not check. That's a conversation that we're having, as well as we don't have on here. But if you watch the December ACD meeting, our director, Dr. Bertinoli, actually, that was something she had brought up, that it would be great if NIH could engage with journals to have that as another layer of collaboration, and then also encouragement to see that the agreement is upheld, and particularly the terms in the data use agreement when researchers go to publish in journals. So that's something we're also looking at. It's not on the slide, but that was brought up by our director, and we're also interested in engaging that pathway.
So the next question, have there been any additional immortal cell discoveries?
I'm not sure about that question. If that person could come off of mute and kind of add more to that.
Immortal cell lines, probably.
There are numerous, I should say, immortal cell lines that have been established from individuals. But I would love to hear clarification so I could better respond.
Yeah. So Cheryl, I mean, I guess, for those immortal cell lines that you are aware of, right? I don't know that they are tied to a particular person's name, so to speak, or that we actually generally know who the original contributor, if you like, was.
So NIH did look at this when crafting the agreement, and there are some other cell lines that have been established from participants where we do know who they are. The difference being that the way that the Lax family have been brought to the spotlight, and they're so widely known, that level of identifiability or awareness, I should say awareness, is not the same as with the Lax family, but there are other cell lines in which they have been immortalized, in which, yes, we do know who those individuals are.
Okay. So I'll just keep going with the questions since there are quite a few left. Are the cells unique in their continuous replication because they were cancer cells, or unique to Miss Lax, or both?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Are the cells unique in their continuous replication because they were cancer cells, or unique to Miss Lax, or both?
That is the $32,000, $64,000 question. Danielle, I see you're off of mute.
No, I think we were both going to say the same thing. Like, that's like $1 million question that I don't think that we could answer right now. But it was something about, the Henrietta Lax's biological
cancer cells, right?
Cancer cells that made them immortal. I don't think we have an answer to that. So I don't know.
Something in the genetic component that makes it immortal, right? So it's
I don't know. I wouldn't even speak to that either. But
yeah.
That's the $1 million question of what it was about her cells that made them immortal.
Yeah.
Cheryl can chime in.
Yeah. Next question: will HeLa cells ever be considered anonymous, de-identified? I mean, right? You all know who that came from. But from a common roots perspective, that is the reason why when I put that polling question out, right? I mean, I chose the best answer being, well, it's deceased. So from the common root perspective, whether it's whatever it is, doesn't really matter. It's not human subjects research from the common root perspective. So you're asking a question. I guess I would, if you're asking specifically whether it would be considered anonymous or de-identified, I probably would not say, strictly speaking, that it would be considered anonymous or de-identified. It's just because we all know who it came from, right? I mean, it's kind of strange to ask that question. Will the recording be sent out to attendees to share with my co-workers? We, OHRP, always try to put these recordings up on our website. We will not be letting you know individually when it's available. It usually takes us a while because we have to make sure that there are closed captions and they work and that it's 508 compliant. So it takes us about a month or more to post it. Once we post it, we'll send it out through the newsletter. So join our OHRP newsletter if you have not already joined it. My colleague will put the link for joining our our listserv. So we will send it out through our listserv and let you know that when it's available, both the 508 compliant set of PDF slides as well. Lax family is protected, but what about other human cells used in human research? Again, I think that, at the moment, I think, cells that are cells and materials, biospecimens that are not identifiable, they are being used in research, right? And if they're being used in an identifiable manner. Generally, there is a requirement to go back and make sure that you get informed consent. And this is out of the respect for persons consideration. If they're used without any identifiers and people, you'll not be able to link them back to individuals, right? So far, under the revision of the common rule, we have asked that investigators going forward would let people who are providing materials for research through research purposes that they know upfront whether their materials that are being collected from the primary research will be used, even if it's in a non-identifiable manner in future subsequent research, right? So that is a notification purpose. And if they're being used in a non-identifiable manner in ways that investigators cannot link back to the individuals afterwards, then there's no additional requirement for informed consent. And that is out of a balance of trying to weigh on the one hand, yes, the ethical responsibility of respecting people's privacy and rights, but at the same time, to ensure that, research can move forward. Now, it is true that so many things, there's so much information out in the world now, and, even things that were not so, to begin with, not identifiable. There may be people who can, because of all the information that's outside, triangulate different sets of information and then eventually identify people and making, this a privacy concern. So going forward, some people are saying, well, don't consider anything that you've given out as, ever going to be non-identifiable and so on. Just treat everything as identifiable. I don't know. I mean, the world is changing very rapidly, right? Okay, we have a lot more messages, but we have really exceeded our time. So my goodness, I think what we can do is to get the list of questions down, and we'll send it over to Cheryl and Danielle. Obviously, this presentation is very popular and people have a lot of questions still. If it's okay with you, Cheryl and Danielle, for those questions that are related to HeLa cells, maybe you can help us answer them, and then we'll send the responses back to the people who've registered on this webinar. How about that? Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
We're happy to.
So wonderful. Thank you so much, audience. Obviously, you have been great. You have asked many, many questions, and we're excited to be here to be talking to you on this subject. And we'll try our best to respond to all your questions and send the list of responses back to you through our, from the emails that you've provided. Okay, so thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks again for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. To our interpreters, and thank you, Spencer. Thank you.